I'm very honored to be here with everyone. My sacred name is Paskustagwan Kiheo Iskwil Unakanio, Bald Eagle Woman Who Leads. And I am from the Saddle Lake Reservation, and I live here in Calgary in Mohkinsis since 1970. I just wanted to pay homage to the ancestors of this area, the land that we call Mohkinsis, Calgary. And I wanted to welcome each one of you. And as we start our meeting per protocol, I want to call upon the ancestors and Creator to lead us in a good way, to make sure that our intentions are coming from our hearts and not just our heads. And the work that we do will be good work for the people, for our communities. We all know that our land needs healing. Not only Mother Earth, but each of us as individuals in our community. And in retrospect, when we think of it, we look at those 215 little souls that were discovered in Kamloops. We want to remember that, and this is just the beginning of what's about to open up. The true history of Canada must be told, and so we as Indigenous people hold that light deep within our hearts, and it is time that we share. But we must share in a good way from our hearts, not with anger. The old people always said, every time you open your mouth, your words must be either healing or they will be hurtful. So we must keep that in mind. So I'll open up. Haksina pelkistimantu kaksivatsien. Nananaskum nanoskamiokiskat nohtalinan. Kmaglanan minan maskuatsun. Minan nisun. Kmagnaulkikahkian wakumaganat. Vistavaukoiskamiopaitsik. Yksi nananaskum nanoskamiokiskat. Hi, hi. Great Spirit, Creator, ancestors, grandfather, grandmother spirits, we come before you with a humble heart to give you gratitude for the gift of life. I want to thank you for all these beautiful people who have come together. We are here to serve our community in a good way, and we just ask your blessings as we move forward together. We ask that you'll bring us together with one heart, one mind, and one spirit, and may all the work that we do be good work for the people. Hi, all my relations. Aho.
All my relations. Thank you so much, Grandmother, for those words, prayers, blessings, and keeping us centered and balanced. In particular, in these times right now, we need all the support and strength from our ancestors, and that includes both our Indigenous and our non-Indigenous folks, for us to remember, where do our ancestors come from? Where do your ancestors come from? And what knowledge and strength and experience have they gone through for you to be standing where you're standing on this land here today? I would like to acknowledge that I am sitting, and most of us, half of us at least, from HelpSeeker are here in the Treaty 7 region, and we acknowledge the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, and of course the treaty signatories, the Tsuut'ina, the Ehe Nakota Nation, which is not far from me. I'm just outside of the city, and this is the Métis Nation, Region 3. But also acknowledge that many of us, like me, I'm from the Chiem First Nation, which is a part of the Salo tribes in British Columbia. I am a guest in this place, and I have been honored to learn from my Blackfoot brothers and sisters, from my elders in Stoney, from the people in Tsuut'ina, the wonderful, kind hearts of the Métis people that I come across, and then of course Grandmother, the Cree, who who steal their way into the territory here in Treaty 7. But for another story, grandmother will tell you that her peoples have been around here for a while as well, and her connection to Calgary. But we'll leave that for another day. And just want to acknowledge that there are many of us here who are guests and are privileged and honored to be here in a space that unfortunately is no longer at all under the stewardship of the original peoples. So to acknowledge that as well. Sending out a special welcome to any and all First Nations leaders, Indigenous service providers who are joining us today, in particular because of this topic that we are talking about. And we hope that through the panelists, we come to you not as experts and not in any way saying that we know exactly what this work entails or what needs to be done. We have some suggested, solutions. We have some things that we're working on together collectively and individually, but we by no means have all the answers. And we hope that you will engage with us in these conversations today. We'll have a couple of opportunities for some interactive questions as well, and then question time at the end. So thank you and welcome. And we look forward to spending just a little bit of time with you today.
Before I go mute myself, I just wanted to say I may have to leave a few minutes early because I have a elder circle I have to do for the university, just in case we're not off on time. Hi, all my relations.
Thank you, grandmother. So just briefly, to give you an overview of our agenda today, we're going to be talking about challenges of self-representation and ownership in data. For those of you that this isn't your first HelpSeeker Technologies webinar, we are a tech-facing company, and this is ever present on our minds, not only because of the work that we do, but in some of the new partnerships and new projects that we've been undertaking, which you'll hear a little bit today. So really want to focus on some intentional storytelling and utilizing Indigenous data appropriately. We have great speaker lineup for you. Amber Potts from the Assembly of First Nations, Aaron Franks from First Nations Information Government Center, Shawn Gervais from Canada's Digital Technology Supercluster, and of course, you've already met grandmother who grounds us all. So that's just a brief overview of what we'll be doing. So for those of you that are new, that this is your first session with us, welcome. For those of you that this isn't, but maybe this is a slide that you gloss over because you've heard us so many times, some things do change, like the number of staff now that we have. Our team keeps growing, and we are up to 53 people within our company, which is amazing. And we had a really insightful staff meeting last week where our co-founders, Travis and Alina, went through a history sort of lesson of how we came to be over the last number of years. And it was so informative and so amazing for us to hear from, from Alina in particular. She's such a great storyteller herself, on how we got to be where we are and how we became this social tech B Corp and what drives us and our values, and the support that we are doing to make this a social tech company that really focuses on those digital solutions for those help seekers, for those service providers, and for decision makers. So if you come to our webinars, they are usually around those three distinct audiences. And of course, we like to acknowledge our national partners within this work, of which we have many regional partners. These are our national ones, CMHC, and the Supercluster, of which, of course, Shawn is representing today. So that's a little bit about us. So first, we wanted to talk a little bit about, and I wanted to touch in particular, some of the challenges that we face, in particular at HelpSeeker because of the work that we do, but we know that this is also a new space in terms of looking at self-representation and ownership in data, not just in our sector, but in many sectors. And as we are thinking of new ways to use data, to use technology to support the social safety net in particular, we have a lot of questions about data ethics and how do we support this work in the best way? How do we support First Nations and Indigenous communities in this work in a space where they have been excluded for the most part in these conversations? That for those of you that have worked perhaps in research or in academia, much work is done to Indigenous peoples in the country and not entirely with, and where there has been big growth in terms of co-creating research with Indigenous and First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities across the country, this technology piece is still pretty new. And we know that there are pockets of things being done across the country, but there still needs to be some more connecting points. One of the things that we have done a lot of, if some of you are familiar with our work in the past, was doing a lot of consultant heavy work where we are working with communities, doing needs assessments, collecting data, compiling that, and presenting it, to communities. And one of the issues, and we know we're not the only ones, or the unique situation, is that a lot of that, the data aggregation, is we're losing those key insights or whitewashing it. And it's removing sort of the things that make the data most interesting in terms of indigeneity, race, and even sometimes in gender, in the way in which surveys are created or the way the analysis is done, where we hear people saying, well, this information is not statistically significant, or sort of things like that. And I am by no means a statistician. I think I've made that quite clear many times. But for me, when I think about data, I think of it as storytelling. And if we are somehow removing those unique pieces of the data, we are essentially removing those voices. And what I've learned from my elders and working in community is that stories are extremely powerful, and that we should acknowledge where those stories come from. There is a part of it that's validation. There's a part of it that's that oral citation, where we have in academia, of course, we learn how to cite things and make sure that we're not plagiarizing and giving credit, because the building of that knowledge to become valid. And in an oral context, that's done through story. So if we associate data collection and analysis and presentation as a type of storytelling, when we remove those markers, we are essentially removing the stories from that, and the power of those individuals to self-report. This is my data, and I own it. I am a First Nations woman who's some odd years with this many children, whatever the data might be. For me, I'd like it to be associated with me, and that's a little bit different when we talk about privacy, but it's something for us to consider, and something that's not easily done, and we're hoping to find some support on that. And then, of course, ensuring that the access piece to this information, to the data, has been something that we struggle with, knowing that technology, if you see our webinars, you've heard probably Lena say this a million times, this fourth industrial revolution, and how much data and the use of technology and AI and machine learning is the future. And we don't want to be lost as a sector in the social services, in that social safety net, social justice lens. We don't want to miss out on those opportunities, because that is where we need to go. And we know that Indigenous communities in particular are constantly being left out. And there are many gaps in different social service sectors where community members are falling into that because of limited funding. Because of colonialism, there are many, many factors. And we know that access to technology, and in particular high-speed internet and bandwidth in communities, some people don't even have computers, but everybody has a smartphone. We want to make sure, how do we advocate and ensure that Indigenous communities have access and can benefit from these data sets, that is storytelling that can help them So these are kind of the challenges that we think about at HelpSeeker, and are always looking for our partners and community members to help us solution those, because we are forward thinking to innovate. How do we innovate and create solutions, rather than saying we don't have a place for that? We all have a place, we believe, to support this work. So yeah. We are trying a brand new thing here. For those of you who have been in our sessions before, we've used something Menti. This is similar. This is a way in which we can get some interaction between everybody. Note, when there's over 200 people, it's hard to do that and open it up for everybody to participate. And this is a way to do that. If you can grab your phone, you just go to slido.com, and it'll prompt you to put in the code. And this code is 660959, and then everybody can take part in this poll, and then it'll pop up on our screen so we can see. So the question is, colonialism is imposed control over another group of people. It can take both subtle and explicit form. How does colonialism manifest itself in data and technology? We'll give everybody time to get onto that at slido.com. How does it manifest? Disproportionate representation. Connectivity, that's a big one. Share the code again, it's 660959. I'll write it in the chat in case people don't have the screen up. Facial recognition tools like Face ID, binary code, unequal access. That's definitely something that our data science team has been talking about in terms of code and the creation of code. What biases do the builders of those pieces have inherently that they don't even know about, that might prevent equitable access and equitable creation of information? Biased questions. Removing Indigenous people from the results. Yes, exactly. And that is a big part in terms of those misallocation of funds, for sure. If you don't have it in the way that the system is designed, you have to utilize the data in order to prove it, right? For that validation, that is the validation system. And if you don't have that data to back up, your claim, or if it's a funding application that you're going for, it makes it really difficult to show the need, right? No awareness of OCAP. Yes, well, Erin will talk about OCAP today, and some of us at HelpSeeker have been taking the training, and it's definitely principles that we have adopted in our work there. Great. Perfect. Thank you, everybody. We'll have more opportunities for questions as well, and make sure that we share all this information out at the end. And so the question is, how might we use technology to help build a social safety net that meets the specific needs of Indigenous peoples? Next slide. I wanted to take a little bit to talk about our values in practice, and I know I'm running out of time, so I want to make sure that everybody else has an opportunity to speak. So I will go over this one quickly. As a First Nations woman who has done both sort of Western academic study in my master's, and also somebody who understands Indigenous ways, both from my own background as a Chiam First Nations woman, but from my teachings from grandmother Doreen, my teachings in the Blackfoot space from Dr. Reg Crozier here in Calgary, I have learned a lot about paralleling systems and how to put values in practice, and how do we sometimes just look for new ways to look at things in order for it to make sense in both spaces without confusing ourselves. Dr. Reg Koshu talks a lot about, that fine line between cultural confusion and the ability to really see those parallels so that I can understand it, so that you can understand it as a non-Indigenous person. And for me, part of indigenization and decolonization of my work is always bringing these practices and these values into my work, no matter what it is. So working at a technology company doesn't cancel out, my indigeneity or my ability to bring those things to the work. And as we're developing new technologies and telling stories using our data, we really need to look at these things with a reconciliation lens. So you'll see here very, very briefly, I have adapted like a very small version of something I developed in my master's in terms of a methodology. And sometimes it's just thinking about things in a different way and calling it something else. I would go and I would find, and I haven't done this yet, what is in my language, or what is the language of the people in which you're working with, or in the community that you're in, how would they call data? What does that mean to them? And in their language, what might that be called? So for me, I think of gathering stories. I think of analysis, of weaving those stories together in context like a basket. I think of validation as checking back also with the owners of those stories for accuracy, not just checking the validation in the Excel sheet and getting my data science team to make sure that everything is correct. That's part of it too. But what is the other pieces? What might be missing? Presenting that information back to the community in witnessing, in that ethical collaborative piece, it is something that's very important to me, to bring things full circle. And the use of data, both from the collection of it, the analysis of it, and then the presenting of those findings, it should all be done when you're working with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous data, in that circle of continuously thinking through their lens. So in that local lens, if you can, in particular, if it's Blackfoot, if it's Cree, if it's Métis, and ensuring that those pieces are ethically in there. And this is ethical storytelling using data. Next slide. So for us, the gathering stories, the data collection, we use Systems Map for that. And for those of you that have seen some of our stuff before, that's sort of where, the tech part of HelpSeekers really came to be, was this Systems Map and taking an inventory of all of the social services within the safety net across the country, of which CMHC is a big supporter of this, and ensuring that we can roll this out across the country. And for us, we are working on, for the first time, looking at First Nations communities and social services, both on and off reserve, in partnership with the Assembly of First Nations for their development for the first time of a national First Nations homeless strategy. So an action plan, rather. So we'll hear from Amber next on exactly what that means, and how this Systems Map and inventory can support their work. Next slide. As a broad overview, before Amber begins, we just want to speak just briefly about the contract that we're doing with on behalf of AFN, is to create that Systems Map. We've been working since May, reviewing both our on and off reserve listings. We've been creating, surveys, and this webinar is a part of it. We'll be hosting webinar sort of regional drop-in calls with First Nations to talk to them about more, in particular, about what does this mean, this Systems Map, what does it involve, how would they like to be involved in it, if they would like to opt in to this process or not, because we know, and we'll hear more about data sovereignty, that the information is theirs to manage and own and control. And how do we support that at HelpSeeker, that meets their needs as well. It's not just about completing the contract, it's about, will this information be useful to communities? and we'll work with them then to see if that's something they would like to opt into. So we're working on developing a lot of, of our own internal systems and processes to make sure that we are in line, with OCAP principles, that we are in line with what the community needs are, and as well fulfilling, this work for the Assembly of First Nations. We have been fortunate to work with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. They're doing a part of this work too, and they have an Indigenous advisory group of Indigenous folks across the country who work in housing and homelessness, who are also making sure that we have a lens and an eye, to them who are working up the front line in housing and homelessness across the country. So it's just a snapshot, of the work. And if you're interested in this, you can connect with us after, and in particular those nations and service providers that are on with us today. We look forward to connecting with you in particular about this work. And we'll just move forward. I want to make sure that there's time for our speakers. And just to note, I just don't want to run out of time. And we'll make sure to send out, this information will all be sent out to everybody if you're on our list. We also send out the webinar recordings for those of you that miss or might have to leave early. It is a little bit of a longer one than usual. So rest assured that we'll make sure you get all of this information and any follow-up information that you might need. I'd like now to introduce Amber Potts from the Assembly of First Nations, and she'll be talking to us in particular, as I referenced, that action plan that they are working on and how we came at HelpSeeker to be a part of that work. Amber.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Elder Doreen Spence, for opening up the meeting in a good way. And thanks, Monique, for inviting me to speak on this this project and work with us on this project. I think systems mapping is, obviously a practical extension of systems thinking, which is something that you and I have worked on for, I think, started 20 years ago. And of course, it was made popular by Peter Senge in the 90s, or maybe even earlier than that. And in Western culture anyways, about thinking of a system, not thinking of a system and thinking holistically, and not, breaking things down into a series of pieces. And of course, that way of thinking is very familiar to First Nations people, because that's the way we approach the world and our worldview. I'm Amber Potts. I'm the Senior Director of the Social Policy Branch at the Assembly of First Nations. I'm coming to you from Algonquin Territory. I'm sorry for the chainsaws in the background. I'm at the lake. I decided I needed some escape from the city. I'm originally from Piikani Nation in Southern Alberta in Blackfoot Territory. And it's nice to hear you speak about former Chief Reg Crowshoe. I've learned a lot from him over the years. So as Monique said, I'm here to provide an update on the work that AFN is doing to advance our mandate to develop an action plan for First Nations homelessness on and off reserve. And I'm going to provide you with a brief description of the work that's done and look at some of the next steps to move this forward. And I'm homeschooling, so I continually have a little critter that interrupts me. Excuse me 1 second.
But I need school.
So if we want to go to slide 1, I think background. So this is a picture of a resolution, and these are the decision points that chiefs and assembly who come together, who are the members of the Assembly of First Nation, come together twice a year and provide us with direction on things that they want us to do. And this one is about an action plan for First Nations homelessness on and off reserve. We know there's an urgent need to address the impact of homelessness and housing insecurity on First Nations living in and away from their communities. Homelessness issues disproportionately affect First Nations due to the historic and ongoing impacts of colonialism. And this includes underfunded housing and infrastructure, as well as social services for First Nations. It's unacceptable that First Nations lack access to safe and adequate shelter in their own traditional territories and lands. The Assembly of First Nations have advocated for improved housing and infrastructure for many, many years, and continues to do so. And this resolution in 2019 is really a reflection of an expanded effort. And at the time was a response to a homelessness, well, was spurred by a homelessness crisis in Vancouver, for dialogue on the floor at the Assembly. First Nations have the right to pursue our own social development, including our own measures and institutions to address homelessness and the impact on our citizens and members, no matter where they live. So it's really important, I think, in this dialogue, especially with so many service providers, to remember that First Nations governments have a responsibility to their citizens, both on and off reserve, and need to be equipped to provide the resources to address homelessness on reserve and off reserve, and support those partnerships to do so. So this resolution was passed, Resolution 79, 2019. And just for a comparative, if there's government nerds out there, this is the equivalent of a cabinet decision for the Assembly of First Nations, a memorandum to cabinet. So slide 2. So the resolution mandates the development of a national First Nations homelessness action plan, which aims to improve the delivery of federal government programs and the related social and fiscal mechanisms to address homelessness for First Nations. So the AFN advocates for a number of different kinds of changes. One is, greater control for First Nations governments over their inherent right to govern and provide services, and also for improved resources and better programs and services. So this resolution is really about better programs and services, but ultimately we're always advocating for greater First Nations control over their governments and the programs and services that they provide. So the resolution advocates for a comprehensive multi-partner approach to reducing, preventing, and ultimately eradicating First Nations homelessness, with the goal of transitioning First Nations housing and infrastructure to First Nations management, control, and care. And this is part of a strategy that the AFN has been working on for quite some time. So the work to develop a national First Nations homelessness action plan aligns with the 10-year National First Nations housing and related infrastructure strategy and the goal of transitioning housing governance delivery systems to First Nations care and control. So in order to advance the mandate to work on this resolution, we're working with Employment and Social Development Canada to determine priorities for the First Nations distinctions-based funding stream of ESDC's federal homelessness prevention strategy, Reaching Home. So distinctions-based is kind of a new, I don't know if it's a new terminology, but what it means is we want a separate approach for First Nations that is apart from the approach to support Métis and Inuit, because we have a unique circumstance and unique relationship with Canada based on treaties and other arrangements. So to date, the ESDC Reaching Home program has not had a distinctions-based funding stream specifically to address homelessness for First Nations in response to First Nations priorities. This funding stream will help First Nations to provide services and build partnerships for their members living both on and away from their communities. It's a pretty lofty goal considering the amount of funding is very small, but we got to start somewhere. The projects funded through the stream will also help to demonstrate needs and best practices in support of the National First Nations Homelessness Action Plan. So in November 2020, the Assembly of First Nations and ESDC established a joint technical committee or joint group to plan, research, and engagement in order to determine these priorities. We want to work closely together with Canada so they know where we're going and we can bring them along to inform the development of the National Action Plan. Can we go to the next slide, please? So our approach is to advancing the work involves 3 phases, so including comprehensive research and engagement strategy, and ultimately the development of the National Action Plan. Go to the next slide, please. So research, the first phase is currently underway. We have 3 avenues of research, including a systematic literature review, an environmental scan, and systems mapping of existing programs and services to identify how to better meet the needs of First Nations people experiencing homelessness on and off reserve. These projects aim to strengthen our understanding of how First Nations specifically experience homelessness, how the experience of homelessness may differ on and off reserve, and how existing programs and services aimed at addressing homelessness serve First Nations, and other information that will inform a distinct approach to addressing homelessness for First Nations, both on and off reserve. And I'll continue to stress that because it's a really unique aspect of this work. So HelpSeeker has been contracted by the Assembly of First Nations on the systems mapping work and is collaborating with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and York University, who are completing the literature review. So a bunch of heavy hitters. Having a map of services will help the AFN advocate for improved services for First Nations experiencing homelessness from an evidence-based perspective, as well as improve First Nations' ability to access services and establish partnerships to support members wherever they live. So slide 5, please. So our engagement strategy. So the second key aspect of the work to develop the National Action Plan is engagement. And that's fundamentally what the AFN does, is talk to people, talk to First Nations, talk to leadership. It's important that this work is done in partnership, and we want to ensure that the National Action Plan is developed by First Nations for First Nations, and it reflects the unique needs and priorities of First Nations in every region across the country. To date, we've had initial discussions with housing technicians and representatives from provincial and territorial organizations in each of our regions, and are currently working on planning a series of regional virtual engagement sessions this fall to hear from First Nations and other partners in each region. And our regions are provincially based. Going forward, we'll also seek out ways to engage at the local and community level in each region, including talking to First Nations members with lived experience with homelessness. Discussions with service delivery organizations are also planned, and we've had some along the way so far. COVID-19, of course, continues to limit the ways in which we can engage. So we're doing an online survey to hear from community members, service providers, and other partners. And this will help us begin hearing directly from First Nations and other partners on what needs and priorities are for addressing homelessness in their communities. This survey is intended to supplement and not replace any other engagement activities. Finally, as a first step in beginning these conversations, we hosted the first ever, the AFN's first ever National First Nations Homelessness Symposium on June 7th and 8th. And it allowed us, the event allowed us to hear from advocates, service providers, as well as First Nations individuals with lived experience with homelessness. I think I had, of course, the opportunity to attend the event, and the lived experience discussion was particularly valuable For me, from a policy and advocacy perspective, you can clearly see from the dialogue the gaps in the system and the service map that they articulated, particularly people with criminal records experience a lot of service gaps. It appears, and the need to prioritize traditional knowledge and cultural practices. These services are just as important as shelter and food. There was a lot. It was a great start to our work and a great start to the engagement. I think that's the last of my slides. So thank you all so much for your time, and apologies for the background noise. And I really invite any questions that you may have when we get to question time.
Thank you so much, Amber. It's wonderful to see the work continue to grow across different sectors and different governance structures, like the Assembly of First Nations in particular. And we've been really fortunate at HelpSeeker to be a part of this, a small part of it, with the COH in York, and also have connected with the other contractor as well, Indigenous, who's doing the environmental scan. And we're all have really looked at this work as not so much in a competition of each other, that we're all doing separate work, but we're doing this work collectively for the AFN and for the country in this work. So we've definitely taken that very seriously in that relationship building of sharing information and collaborating together. So thank you. Looks like we have our next Slido poll, the same code, slido.com. Why does ownership and self-representation matter? Dignity. Amber mentioned a little bit about the need to create unique funding streams and unique set of circumstances and assessments and the allocation, because of the unique relationship that First Nations people have with the government, based on treaties, based on whether that's official treaties or non-official treaties. The relationship that First Nations people have as the First Peoples, we have a very different and unique legal relationship with Canada, and sort of the rights and freedoms that we are privy to in that uniqueness because of that relationship, because of those legally and constitutionally protected rights and freedoms. Autonomy, we can learn from for Indigenous peoples. Control and value of lives. Yes, I think we hear a lot, not just from Indigenous or First Nations, Métis, Inuit people who are in the social safety net, who struggle with housing and homelessness, but that the dignity and respect and self-representation to be able to make those decisions for themselves in the services and programs, and to be seen as human beings rather than a number within the system, is really important for that dignity. Yes. So the data map is a true service of communities. Vital for reconciliation and healing. We're not an add-on or adaptation. And I think, utilizing that reconciliation lens, the decolonizing, indigenizing, whatever you want to call it, what we hear more and more across the country in all of our work is the need to work sooner with community in the co-creation of all these things, and not have something that's already made, that's already baked, and then bring it to them and say, okay, now how do we tweak it? How do we make it fit for you? How do we make it Indigenous, when it's already been designed and created and running, and somehow we're supposed to fit in, to that mold. And this is really this work in particular is looking at a way to make it unique, to start from the beginning with Indigenous perspectives, worldview, and practices embedded at the center. Right? Thanks, everybody. Moving on now, we'll hear from Erin Franks from the First Nations Information Governance Center. Sorry, everyone, I have braces and sometimes my words and my mouth don't work quite as well in my pronunciation. And he'll be speaking to what does data sovereignty mean in practice and why does it matter? Thanks, Erin.
Thanks so much, Mo. Well, that's great. Well, the slide looks lovely. Thanks for designing it and putting it in the deck like that. Thanks very much. Yes, First Nations Information Governance Center is a bit of a mouthful, whether you have braces or not. So no problems there. FNIGC is where I work. Mo and all of us gathered here. Thanks so much, Grandmother Doreen, for bringing us together at the beginning here. And thank you so much to HelpSeeker, Mo, Alina, Jillian for inviting me. It's a real privilege and a real pleasure to be on this panel with Amber and Shawn and all of you, wherever you are. I'm speaking to you, listening to you from unceded Algonquin territory too. Like Amber, I am, however, in my basement. No chainsaw sounds here, but you may hear plumbing and hot water heater turning on and the occasional dog bark. My role at FNIGC is as a senior advisor, largely with education and training and research on information governance and the OCAP principles, which we'll talk about here in a minute. I've been at FNIGC for about 3 years. I'm a guest here in Ottawa and Algonquin unceded territory from out west originally. I want to give a shout out to Angela in the chat. I've always loved this name in Cree, but I've never said it, so I want to try and say it now. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory, Edmonton. I'm Misquachiwaskahaikan, and I don't know if I've got that right, but so apologies to any Cree speakers here, but it's a beautiful word and I wanted to try and say it. My background is Anglo-Métis. I have roots in Birch Hill, Saskatchewan and the Red River settlement, as well as lots of Northern European background, English, Irish, German, Norwegian. So my family story is sort of one of movement all across the Northwest from Mushkegowuk Cree territory all the way into North Central Alberta. And I'm really pleased to be where I am now with FNIGC. So after Amber's very detailed description of the house of the homelessness systems mapping project, I'm going to sort of pull back a little bit to the broader topic of just what is First Nations data sovereignty. And in the little time that we have here, address why it matters and provide some observations on what it looks like in practice. Although I have to say data sovereignty is happening in practice in so many ways all over the place. So my list of examples will be very limited, and I'm sure many of you will have your own examples of work if you are in a community or an organization that represents a community. And thank you very much, Amber, too, for your discussion here. Can I get the next slide, please? I'm just keeping an eye on the time. Okay. So a lot of text here. Well, thank you, designers at HelpSeeker, for squeezing all that in. I think the first question really with what is First Nations data sovereignty is defining what is First Nations data. And we take a very broad and inclusive view of that. I think there's lots of room to split hairs about, you'll probably see many technical definitions of what is data versus what is information. Sometimes those discussions get a little bit abstract. You know, for our purposes at FNIGC, we consider data to be First Nations data to be any information or data about First Nations. And a very small example, typically that's information on demographics, housing, health, labor, education, information about First Nations, and then information from First Nations, that is what you might call distinctly First Nations. These are languages, cultures, traditional knowledges, stories, songs, ceremonies, and then of course any information about First Nations territories. And that's the land and waters, and also the medicines, animals, swimmers, flyers, four-leggeds, anything to do with the resources and environment. So you may actually, the better question might be often, what isn't First Nations data? When we talk about data sovereignty, it's important to recognize that both data and sovereignty are complex issues. There's a lot of moving parts there, but at the end of the day, the concept is quite powerful, and it really means that First Nations data is governed by First Nations themselves, according to their own laws and practices and customs. And it's really centered in First Nations as collective rights holders, or holders of collective rights. First Nations are sovereign nations and rights holders, and they have an inherent right to govern their lands and peoples and resources. And information and data, seen on the left here, this is very much part of the bundle of resources that First Nations governments and peoples have responsibility for caretaking for their own people. So these are, inherent rights as Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. They are also constitutionally protected in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution and in Section 25 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and also noted in the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People, which Canada is a signatory to. And I believe the bill enshrining UNDRIP into law was passed in the Senate last night here. So a big advance there, a big piece of news there for Indigenous people in Canada when it comes to UNDRIP. At the bottom there, you'll see that bullet point of people's data and information are a people's collective resource. And I think this is really important to stress that so much of the contemporary discussion around information and data in the mainstream context contains a lot of givens, a lot of questions that are kind of considered answered. That data is a public good. That data is that governments have a right to hold data about citizens, and in return, citizens get certain benefits and services provided by the government because they hold that data, or that data enables them to provide. And I think it's really important to say that those givens, those questions need to be reopened and asked when we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty and First Nations data sovereignty, that First Nations have a right to decide which issues data will be applied to and how they're going to go about doing that. So, there's a kind of social contract between, for example, the government of Canada and the people of Canada, that you renounce certain bits of privacy and you give over certain bits of data to the state in order to receive services. And that contract between First Nations people and their governments is between them. And that's one of the key components of First Nations data sovereignty, is having that right to govern data for the benefit of your people. Can I get the next slide, please? So, as I said, right, there's a lot of moving parts here. Our partners, colleagues in BC, the British Columbia First Nations Data Governance Initiative, co-wrote a paper back in 2017. It's available on their website, BCFNDGI, and there they articulate 10 principles of data sovereignty. And I think these are really important because, as I said, there are sort of textbook definitions of what data or information is. And then you might have textbook, quite technical definitions of what sovereignty means. And you'll see technical definitions of what information governance is from an organizational viewpoint. There are lots of manuals and training opportunities out there that say in an organization, you have a chief technical officer or a chief data officer who is responsible for these elements of data governance, and then various roles under that: data steward, data analyst, etc. Well, I think it's important to say that these are not sovereignty, and the governance of information by First Nations people for their own benefit is not, can't be reduced to that technical element. So it's important to kind of recognize the the distinctive nature of First Nations data sovereignty here. You know, in the language of engagement, we often hear the word stakeholders, and First Nations are not stakeholders. They are rights-holding nations, governing bodies, unions, professional associations, business organizations. These are stakeholders. Governments are not stakeholders. They're rights holders. They represent the interests and the will of their people. And First Nations are not a homogenous group. I saw in the chat earlier, you know, a comment that we need to stop using this marker Indigenous, that there are, you know, differences. Of course, nations are nations. They're distinct, whether they're First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Of course, that's an important distinction in the Canadian context. But even within that, there are distinctive Inuit groups, distinctive Métis groups, and distinctive First Nations, each with different aspirations and worldviews. And in that vein, right, First Nations data sovereignty needs to be defined by First Nations themselves. And we'll get to that here in a second when we talk about OCAP, that the principles of OCAP are asserted by First Nations. Data is not neutral. Data collection processes aren't neutral, and data collection isn't new to First Nations people. First Nations people have been collecting data in various forms since time immemorial. There's a quote by Basil Johnson, the Ojibwe thinker and teacher and knowledge holder. You know, traditionally, we are a contemporary people. And I love to reflect on that when we think about technology, AI, blockchain, the cloud, these contemporary technologies and what they mean to Indigenous data sovereignty. Well, traditionally, First Nations people are always present in that moment, using the tools available to them to flourish, and that includes contemporary technologies. You know, in the vein that data is not neutral, it must be relevant to First Peoples and needs for each First Nation. That means controlling the research agenda and the data collection agenda. And data practices are diverse and can celebrate different worldviews. Sometimes they're in conflict, but not necessarily. And there's room for coexistence and braiding together. And in you know, thinking of Basil Johnson's quote, traditionally we are a contemporary people. None of the exercise of sovereignty over data is not about being caught in a particular moment in time. It's about building on and working through the past to develop current and future processes and policies. It's about transforming the 5 Ds of First Nations data, which have been defined as disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. And in the First Nations context in Canada, it's very much about the principles of OCAP, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Could I get the next slide, Mo? Thanks. So why does First Nations data sovereignty matter? Well, as I mentioned, a people's data and information are a people's collective resource. And when you think about the jurisdiction of the Canadian state and of the provinces and municipalities, this is really a treasured resource. And there's really no difference. Why would there be a difference between how those governments see data and how those societies see data and how First Nations and other Indigenous societies see data? And this is, of course, you know, been pointed out many times and in many occasions by governance organizations at various levels, international, national, and local, that access to data and information about a nation's citizens, lands and waters and economies, natural resources is critical to good governance and to sustainable development. And this slide here is borrowed from our friends in the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, our colleagues in the United States. The cycle between having data for governance and the governance of data, these things work hand in hand. The building of data and information's governance systems contributes to nation rebuilding. And you know, when we at FNIGC, as a technical and apolitical organization, think of nation rebuilding, this is really in the hands of First Nations people themselves. Forms of governance were imposed by the Canadian state, by colonialism. There are many different ways that First Nations are organizing horizontally and together to reconstitute something like the 61st nations that existed prior to the imposition of the Indian Act, based on culture, territory, history, who can, and we, you know, we're very, at FNIGC, you know, we're very much about supporting leadership and membership as defined by leaders and members themselves when it comes to information governance and supporting First Nations in that space. Can I get the next slide, please? Before I go on, actually, we don't need to go back Mo. I just wanted to reflect on, you know, what Amber really stressed, and it's true of our work at FNIGC, that it's really about everyone counting. So it's important that governance of information, that First Nations have the tools, the capacity, and the choices available to them to provide the same level of care and control, which is a wonderful phrase, right? It's not just control for its own sake. It's about care of collectively shared resources like data and information for collective benefit. That First Nations are able to exercise that function for all the people, the many people who live off reserve and away from home, which for some nations constitutes like the majority of their population. So for us at FNIGC, I think it's important to, you know, our work in the area of quantitative research and data collection has taken place since the mid-90s through a series of surveys, which do happen on reserve in the northern and remote communities. You might be familiar with the Regional Health Survey and the First Nations Labor and Economic Development Survey and others. While those surveys take place on reserve, the OCAP principles and First Nations data sovereignty, this is being exercised by First Nations on behalf of all of their members, no matter where they live. And that includes in urban settings and off reserve as well. So what does it look like? Well, in many respects, the First Nations principles of OCAP are the main lens for First Nations expressing data sovereignty. I want to direct you to our website, fnigc.ca, and there are many other resources out there that discuss OCAP. Many of you are probably familiar with the OCAP principles already. The principle of ownership, this states that First Nations own data that is from, of, or about them, regardless of where it is held. Control, is the broad principle of First Nations must have control over data and information, again, regardless of where it's held. And it's a very broad principle, but I think some of the power of it, the good work it does, is that it makes us think about the entire life cycle of data, that it's not just about data collection. It's about setting the very agenda about how and why data is collected. And we know that the Canadian government and ISK over-collect so much data. So it's really not, that's not about, you know, the good governance or stewardship of data. It's about why is it collected in the first place? And does it need to be? All through the life cycle of data to its eventual long-term preservation or even destruction. Access, this is a really important principle. First Nations have to have access to their own data, again, regardless of where it's held, and they also have to control who else has access to data. And this is often because First Nations are, unfortunately, do not have the same rights or respect accorded to them as other governments do, need to rely on contract law and data sharing agreements to exercise that level of control. And possession is the principle where First Nations should have the right to possess data that's for, by, or about them. And I think in the digital age, it's really important to recognize that possession takes many different forms. And at FNIGC, we're working through thinking about, you know, cloud technologies and related technologies, and how possession is really about exerting jurisdiction over your data in the digital space and not necessarily having it on your own territory. So OCAP, those are the principles, and, you know, they work in three different ways. I think that at a minimum, they are a set of standards that establish how First Nations data should be collected, protected, and used and shared. More importantly, they reflect a commitment to use and share information in a way that brings benefit to the community. So this is not just a minimum set of technical standards. This is a normative or nation building set of standards that is about unleashing the benefits of data. And in that, more broadly, this is about pursuing data sovereignty as part of the project of self-determination. And this is fundamentally tied to the preservation and development of culture. And as Amber pointed out, culture, language, these are as or more important than, you know, in the example that Amber shared on the nuts and bolts of housing. As important as those are, it is the bundle of care and services that's really important. So what does it look like in practice? I'm going to speed along here. OCAP's happening at various scales. So if you go to our website, you'll get a link to our online course, The Fundamentals of OCAP, and that provides a lot of information on how OCAP's applied. You can go to the Tweakin Partnerships website that's up in the upper right here. This is a group of 5 Mi'kmaq First Nations in Unamaki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, who came together to create a data system where those nations would have access to their own data on the health of their citizens in order to make improvements in health policy and healthcare delivery specific to those nations. So their data is disaggregated from the Nova Scotia data. Control over access to that is strictly controlled by the First Nations themselves, and yet they have the benefit of seeing their data linked to other data sets so that they can make good evidence-based policy decisions on healthcare in their communities. FNIGC hosts the First Nations Data Center, which houses all of the data from the surveys that I'd mentioned, the Regional Health Survey, FN-led, FN-REIS. This is an example of OCAP in action, where that data is carefully stewarded on behalf of the First Nations who participate in the data collection program. Access is carefully regulated, only under approval by a committee is access permitted to other researchers. And then in the non-First Nations sector, I think it's important to see how OCAP's being committed to by a variety of institutions. And we want to thank you, Mo. We want to help our partners in different areas live up to their commitments. So for example, the University of Saskatchewan has a learning charter where all of their students are expected to adhere to the principles of OCAP. The Association of Canadian Archivists has their guidelines for graduate programs in archival studies. This is guidelines for how archivists in Canada should be trained. And according to this document, it should be in line with the principles of OCAP. We also have, of course, many federal government commitments to First Nations data sovereignty and the OCAP principles, including joint communications and agreements between the government and AFN that at the Joint Advisory Committee on Fiscal Relations, that First Nations data sovereignty should be supported in real terms, in terms of capacity building by the federal government. And this is inclusive of, this would also include oversight over how the many agencies and departments in the government of Canada collect and house First Nations data. Can I have the last slide here? I've got a few seconds here to slide to home. And one question I want to leave you with here, when we talk about the principles of OCAP, we talk about sovereignty. This is a rights-based, the exercise of sovereignty is about the exercise of rights and who holds them. And as you know, people who raise awareness around OCAP at FNIGC, we often talk about the difference between asserting those rights and respecting those rights. So for those of us here who are working for First Nations, who are for First Nations, it is our privilege and our ability to assert these rights over our data. And for those people in the tech sector, in the not-for-profit sector, in the non-Indigenous government sector, it's your role to respect and make space for First Nations to assert those rights. Thanks very much. I think I'm at time. I rushed through that a little bit. Thanks a lot. Look forward to a discussion after Shawn's presentation.
Thank you, Aaron. I think that is a very good segue into Shawn in terms of the perspective of a non-Indigenous organization in particular within the tech sector. You know, what does it look like to be accountable, to meet those needs, to promote and allow space for that assertion. And I will just turn it right over to Shawn for time.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm with a digital supercluster and I run the foresight practice there. I'm pleased to be coming to you from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, in particular the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. I just want to give my gratitude to grandmother Doreen. I'm always delighted when an elder comes to remind us about taking on our undertakings with good hearts and to do it for the benefit of the people. And so I'm always incredibly grateful. So thank you, grandmother Doreen, and delighted to be here this morning. It's a big question there. And so I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I thought I would focus on improving accountability in tech development through the process of design. So if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, next slide. So I chose design because I think that's the real leverage point. And I think one of the things that's important to emphasize when we talk about technology, that it's actually not about technology, it's about people. And so the starting point for all of this is around building relationships. And these are relationships around trust and mutual respect with people who genuinely want to work together, right? So, you know, we can talk about processes and we can talk about different kinds of things, but there's no substitute for goodwill in the human spirit. And one of the things that I really appreciated, the Assiniboine Winnewac Nation just outside of Grand Cache would hold these backcountry camps where they would bring together industry, government, and members of the community to just sit and talk. And I don't know, you know, for those who can see my screen, but when I attended there, I built a drum, you know, and it wasn't, you know, it's not about the drum, but it's about sitting with people, learning about the history, learning about the things that they are worried about. You know, another memory from that is, you know, one of the elders took a few of us out back and they wanted to show us something, and we picked some white berries and she swirled them up in a cup to have a little treat. And what she told us was this was Indian ice cream, right? And I was like, oh, like this is so cool. But it begins with that, right? It begins with human connection and the idea that you really want to work together. And sometimes when people talk about barriers to collaboration or barriers to working, you know, you have to ask, is the actual genuine intent there? Because when the genuine intent is there, quite often barriers are just viewed as obstacles overcome. So you sit there with your buddy or your partner and say, well, what are we going to do about this, right? It doesn't actually shock you. So that's, you know, the foundational piece is this, the importance of building good working relationships with people who genuinely want to do some good stuff. Next slide, please. So for me, I think the real leverage point, I call it creating design spaces. And what I'm really trying to convey is this idea of a place, you know, almost like a place where you come talk about how you do certain things. So this is not a process where you're putting input. This is an actual meeting place where you talk, because that's where all the big decisions are made. You know, a number of years ago when I was looking, you know, I've been in the innovation space for a number of years, and of course, you know, sustainable development and the environmental issues are quite critical. And you talk about needing, you know, 4-fold improvements in processes or 10-fold improvements. And if you work within a current system, you're constrained. So for example, if you know, I'm driving to work and I say, geez, I'd like to reduce my carbon footprint, and I just concentrate on the car I'm in and the path I'm in, you know, I could do a few things different. Maybe I could gas up a little different. Maybe I could manage my speed, but the range of improvement is incredibly narrow. There's only so much I can do because I'm boxed in by, you know, the way I'm doing things now. It's only when I step outside that space and say, well, maybe I could move closer to my work, or maybe I could bring my work closer to me, or maybe I should change my car, or maybe I should bike to work, or it's that ability to step outside the system. So when you're working within a system, you're defined by the constraints of the technology or the constraints of the governance framework. And while I'm not saying you can't make improvements, your range of improvements are limited by the constraints of the existing system. So if you're actually trying for breakthrough innovation or breakthrough change or breakthrough pieces, you have to be able to step outside and look at different alternatives, and the design space is ideal for that. You know, the other reason I like the design space is because it emphasizes humanity, it emphasizes connections to people. Storytelling is an important part of the design discipline. And it's a place where you set standards, where you decide, here's how we're going to work together. And on the slide here, you see a couple of different examples. Got an example from Vincent Design, their graphic design and web design shop out of Winnipeg, but they've got some really thoughtful writings on best practices for Indigenous design. So if you're curious, that's a great element. The Indigenous Design Charter comes out of Australia. And again, it's another set of principles and designs on, you know, if you're going to work with Indigenous communities, what's a good way to do that? And then the graphic with the 2 eyes, that's from Micmac elder Albert Marshall, just talking about 2-eyed seeing, you know, looking at the world through both, you know, let's call it a Western, or, you know, whatever terminology you want to use, a Western and an Indigenous kind of thing, and having a broader perspective about the world. And the key point here is that when you create your design space, right, if you want to create a design space in the social piece, you can choose what standards you want to make. These are all good reference points, but you can actually say, this is what's important to me, this is what's important to my community. And it becomes the sort of like a go-to place to kind of think things through. And it's a place for creativity and learning versus control and dynamics. So so if there was one takeaway, that's the one, encourage people to create design spaces where they can step outside systems and actually, set standards and norms. Next slide, please. So when we talk about design, there's 3 little pieces that I'm going to talk about just in terms of the impact of design, and the one that everybody will be aware of is design for outcomes. But the thing I'd like to just reinforce is that data sovereignty is a means to an end, not an end in itself. And we see this not just in data sovereignty, but in technology or intellectual property, where you can sometimes get caught in a self-reinforcing loop. So for example, I'll use intellectual property. People will say intellectual property is really important. Okay, what do you do? Well, we need an IP strategy and protection. Okay, so why? Because IP is important, right? And so you kind of go in this little circle where each thing is reinforcing itself. But the question is why? What's the point of the exercise, right? So when it comes to data sovereignty, why? Well, like what part of people's lives are you trying to, is it education? Is it health? In this case, we heard about homelessness. And so with line of sight to purpose, then you can say, well, what aspects of data do we really need? What do we really want to share? And then when I share, what are my expectations with that? If I jump to the environmental context, a lot of times people will say, let's pool data because that's good. And if you give me your data, you can have access to mine. Well, do I really need access to your data? Maybe I'm more interested in what you do with my data. So if you produce some environmental reports about the water and they're confidential, well, you use my data to do that. So I want a copy of that. I want access to the things that you're creating with my data. But I don't think like that if I don't understand the purpose of what it is, or what I call, line of sight to outcome. Why fundamentally am I trying to do this? Next slide. So outside of outcomes, I think the other another part is relationships, right? Strengthening connections to people, technology, and the land. So when I talk about people, and if we just talk about the tech sector, I think there's a lot of people who have good intentions and they're well-intentioned and quite keen to engage with Indigenous peoples and communities, but and people in the audience will know it much better than I. But a lot of times they're quite naive, right? We already talked about how there isn't the Indigenous, right? It's not First Nation, it's First Nations, right? There's diversity in that community, right? It's not homogenous, and so Indigenous 101 might be a good intro, but you need to actually take time to learn about the communities that you're working with and the nuances and what they need, and it's different, right? The second thing is because there's such a and I never know the best way to talk about this, but it's like there's fundamentally different worldviews, right? And so I think one of the things that people underestimate is that when you take an Indigenous person out of their community, it's not just from one community to another. You're actually taking them from a place that has a certain worldview into another worldview, which is quite a shock. And so one of the design principles that I like to emphasize is bringing the service to the people rather than the people to the service, right? Not to underestimate the importance of being able to keep people in the social space where they feel comfortable and strong. And when you look at things technically, you're only looking at the functionality piece. You say, well, what's the problem, right? There's the spot's over there. Why can't we take that person and move them to the spot? And that's more efficient for all these reasons. But you've totally missed the social context. You've totally missed the social support. That if you take them out and put them over there, their probability of getting the outcome that you want drops dramatically, not because of technical issues, but because of social. So find ways to get the service into the community or with the people. And then the other one is just around this sense of sacredness and connection to the land. it's different. And again, I don't know how to describe it except to point to it. But even in terms of storytelling, for example, when storytelling is embedded in the culture, there's a certain sacredness. And so, for example, the fact that I hear a story does not entitle me to say it, right? If I do not have that lived experience, if I do not really understand that, and new people aren't going to get that. And you say, so what do we do about that? That's why the design space is so important, because you can go back to the design place and unpack this, right? And give people the space to learn, right? Because, the reality is that a lot of people with good intentions, they're going to be awkward the first piece. And without that space to learn, it can be frustrated. But if you can bring people back to design space and say, let's unpack this, let's unpack what this really means. Let's help us understand each other together. That's absolutely critical. And then when I talk about technology, right? You choose what technology to adopt. And the other one is data is not neutral, neither is technology, right? There's always pros and cons. There's always pluses and minuses. People who pitch technology tend to overemphasize the positive, underestimate the negative. Again, not through any maliciousness. It's just the natural inclination. But, what is the relationship with technology? How is technology embedded into the culture and things like that? And then land. I talk about land simply as a reminder to connect to culture, connect to land, connect to the essential pieces. So when we're designing services, we want to embed them into the framework. Next slide. And then lastly, design for voice and visibility, where we talk about exercising agency, affirming the importance of traditional knowledge and community stewardship, right? And I think Aaron talked about this as a collective resource. On an agency, the one thing that I want to just kind of raise that I've always found interesting is, in order for someone to exercise agency, they have to believe that they have it. And we're looking at a program for youth, and one of the elders talked about the need to unlock people's dream machines, that the dream machine was stuck. And it's the idea that if I can't even imagine that this future is possible, it doesn't matter what solutions you put in front of me, because every single one of them won't work because my dream machine is locked. I can't even imagine myself being in that situation. And so agency, is not just about telling people they have the right, it's helping them see the full potential of their life or their full potential of their community. And so let's go to the last slide. So the way I wanted to end this was with a quotation from Ike Solway of Siksika Nation. And Ike, about 15 years ago, when I was at the Alberta Research Council, we created this Aboriginal internship program for land stewardship. And Ike was one of the first two graduates. The other graduate was Jan Noski from Big Stone Cree Nation. And so one of the things we asked Ike to do is, could you give us a summary, that we could share with other people so that they could appreciate, how this program might help and things like that. And so this is what he gave us. And he said, whose voice is heard on this land? That's what it comes down to. We have to hear the voice of our people when we communicate our needs to stakeholders, and we have to hear the voice of our ancestors asking us to take care of our traditional home. And in the context of social services, because the context here, of course, was environmental, if I turn that into families, the corollary is whose voice is heard, about our families. That's what it comes down to. We have to hear the voice of our people when we communicate our needs to stakeholders, and we have to hear the voice of our ancestors asking us to take care of our families. So I thought that was kind of like his voice would be an ideal way to kind of end and just reinforce, the value of relationships. And again, if I had that one point, the value of design space or design place where you can come to actually work out a lot of the issues that you're going to bump into as you try to work with technology or data or what have you. So those are my comments. I hope they were helpful, and I'll turn it back to the moderators.
Thank you, Sean. I think that also was makes everything come full circle. And of course, when we think about, how grandmother started us off and like grounding us in our ancestors and calling them to be here in this space with us, that resonates, for sure. And the relationship piece, of course, that's something that my team, my community success, is always so thoughtful of. Like, we can't do any of this work without those relationships, and to ground it and say that is also something to think about in technology. And then it's not just about, the front facing pieces like my team does when they're out in community, but behind the scenes too, it's that what is the relationship that we have in those spaces to the data, to all of these sort of interconnected pieces. I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much. We have about 4 minutes, and I know that there's a couple of questions at least in the chat, in the Q&A that were directed to Amber, and I think Amber wanted to address those. So I'll just open that for you, Amber.
Thanks, Mo. And I could have typed them in, but I said I would answer them live, and then I couldn't type in the answer. So just on who do we partner with and why do we partner with organizations, what we do is we have a comparative request for proposal process. And so for all of our research work, whether it be with academics or legal experts, we issue a call for proposals. There's a set criteria that the AFN works with, and we send it out through our networks, through housing technicians, the Chiefs Committee on Housing, for example. And then my team does research on, the area and who is working in this area, and the RFP goes out that way. And we get proposals and we evaluate them based on their organization's experience working with First Nations, their experience with the methodologies that we're looking at, and of course the standard like value for money and quality of the services they're able to provide. So that's generally how we approach that type of work. We also have, high-level partnerships and MOUs that we are directed to enter into by Chiefs and Assembly, and those are a little bit different types of arrangements. I hope I answered that quickly. And there's also, you can go to our website and there's information on all open RFPs and job postings. I encourage you to take a look. We're hiring. And in terms of the identity question, which is a lot harder, the question is, with so many forms of identity used in different nations, how can we respect them outside of the colonial context, using the imposed federal registry as identity markers? That's a tough question. First Nations themselves, many have their own band membership codes. And so it's up to them and whoever, perfect or imperfect those membership codes are, to define their members. We're of course aware and advocated really strongly on the disenfranchisement of women. There was, federal legislation, Bill S3, that was passed a couple of years ago that opened up the federal registry. So there's, two paths of, official identity, band membership, and the colonial system where the government just defines who Indians are. And then of course there's, most importantly, how people identify themselves. And in terms of services, First Nations are obligated to provide services to their members. And then we of course know that a lot of urban service providers have kind of an open door policy. However you show up and you need services, they're there to provide them. I don't know if that answers your question, but it gives you perhaps a little bit of context around the identity politics, which we could write a thesis on. It's a tough question.
We'll have another webinar for that one. We could talk about identity for sure. Identity politics in data too. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm aware that it's now 10:30. Just want to make note before we close on our next webinar, if that's something you're interested in, you love hearing what we have to share. The next one is July 22nd, and we'll be talking about a project we've been working on for a while called Data to Action, building capacity for a systems change using data, a very unique and interesting project rooted here in Alberta. I'm going to turn it over now just to grandmother, if we can catch her while she's still here, to close us out and send us off like she started us. Thank you.
Hi, Nananaskum. Now, I give you much gratitude for this meeting. You warm my heart because it gives me hope for the future. Every time I do a circle, I always say to people, my takeaway word, I must have one word that I can take away from this meeting. And so today, the word that I want to take away with me is wahkuhtuin, which means we're all related. And our Mother Earth provides all that we need, and she takes care of us, and we must continue to take care of her and each other. And so this is a time for me where I would like to wish you all blessings as we depart and go our separate ways. We never say goodbye. We always say, I'll see you again next time or sometime. And so again, hi nananaskum now. I'll bless you all, bless your families and your communities and the good work that you're doing. Hi, all my relations.
Okay, all my relations. Thank you everybody for coming. I know it was a longer one than usual. We just seem to we have so much of information to share. It's hard to pack it all into 1 hour. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time. Please feel free to send any of us a line. Check out our website, our partners' websites and information if you need anything else. We're happy to collaborate and connect in any way that we can. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you.